Well, welcome to Jesus and the Multitude, chapter 23 of Brian McLaren's book, We Make the Road by Walking. I'm Reverend Lance, the minister here at First Congregational United Church of Christ in Alpena, and with me across the table is Lee Copeland. Lee Copeland has a long history of background, much of it being in the evangelical tradition, and he has come to us with a lot of reading, N.T. Wright, Dr. Gene Scott, and various people. And in the middle is our pastor emeritus from the church here, Reverend Bob Case, my predecessor here in the pulpit. It's good to have you all back in this conversation. The topic of Jesus and the multitude, Brian McLaren points out a three-tiered sociology. At the top, he says 1, 3, 5% maybe of the people at the pinnacle. They're the ones that hold and hoard a lot of the wealth, the power, the influence, the opportunities are open to them. And they make networks throughout media, government, and the rest. And then below that is what he calls the multitudes, or the masses, many of whom are on the verge of powerlessness, poverty. A great number of them are the day laborers, simple professions, small farmers, children, various people that are on the verge of being expendable in the eyes of the elite. But in between, there are some mediators, some middle-tier management type people, stewards, tax collectors, ones, as he says, in fact, I'll read it from his page 107 here. The three-tiered system in the middle are stewards, tax collectors, and their associates who extract income from the poor and the powerless that are below them for the sake of the rich and the powerful who are above them. Well, in addressing the social realities of his day, Jesus constantly turned that normal dominance pyramid upside down, to the confusion even of his own followers. And I'm going to give some examples, and this is again page 107 in the book. Take, for example, the time a group of parents brought their little children to Jesus to be blessed. Their great teacher had important places to go, important people to see, so the disciples tried to send them away, but Jesus rebuked them. Let those little children come to me, he said, for of such is the kingdom of God. Or take the time that Jesus and his disciples were passing through Samaria, a region that proper folks hated to pass through because its inhabitants were considered religiously and culturally unclean. Jesus decided to wait outside the city while his companions went into town to buy lunch. And when they returned, Jesus was sitting by a well, deep in a spiritual, theological conversation with a Samaritan woman, and one with a sketchy reputation at that. The sight of Jesus and this woman, talking respectfully, was a triple shock to the disciples. Men didn't usually speak with women as peers. Jews didn't normally associate with Samaritans. And clean people didn't normally interact with those that they considered morally stained. Or take the time Jesus and his disciples, accompanied by a large crowd, passed a blind man along the road. The man seemed marginal, insignificant, just another beggar. And the people around told him, quiet down, when he started crying out for mercy. But to Jesus, he mattered. The same thing happened when Jesus was on his way to heal the daughter of a synagogue official named Jairus. Along the way, Jesus was touched by a woman with an embarrassing female problem that rendered her unclean. She didn't even think she was important enough to ask for Jesus' help. Jesus healed her, publicly affirmed her value, and then he healed the official's little girl. Little children, a Samaritan, a man who might today be classified as disabled, certainly unemployed, a frightened, unclean woman, a little girl. See, they all mattered to Jesus. Weak, vulnerable people, the multitudes, they all mattered to Jesus. Again, that's Brian McLaren's comment and gives us a good sense of who we're talking about when we talk about the multitudes, the many. We also have this kind of triangular way of looking at society, with elites at the top who are the movers and the shakers, the power brokers, the ones that hoard and have much of the wealth, power, influence. And in the middle, people who are stewarding that system, often to the advantage of the power brokers and drawing assets from the multitude. That's the picture of what this particular chapter deals with. And having heard a sermon about it, my synopsis right now, what are some of the things that struck you? And I'll start, Lee, if it's okay with you. What in particular struck you in this, either as a challenge, a question, or inspiring? What would you like to begin with?
Well, it started off You know, the very strong language and negative tone of describing that system, the economic system, felt like where we were going was going to be a kind of common anti-establishment complaint about the economic structure per se. And in those examples, I don't see, you know, the children is a good example. Didn't seem to fit. That's not what he's really complaining about. And in the message, it wasn't as you could take those first things, hoarding the money, making the rules, rigging the game. It sounds like, you know, standard. We have a corrupt system, and that could be used to inflame the people in the lower to rise up and overthrow it. And when that language of putting the pyramid on its head, I kept saying, oh, I'm seeing this going, that he's feeding a narrative that would be almost certainly understood by the people around as being a revolutionary thing, and he wasn't. As a matter of fact, Jesus, you know, from the Jesus that I'm with, resisted that resistance. He was crying over Jerusalem and saying, look, that's not what we're supposed to do. So it was very good to see that more, no, he's really talking to the people who, on a personal level, they don't want to change that thing. They want the people in those levels to respect and be generous to each other, not change that structure.
So that sense of it being a revolutionary thing we're going to read, like Marx's Das Kapital or something, where we're giving an analysis of society. Now the revolution has to come to turn it over. Jesus didn't go there. It sounded like that, but he didn't go there.
That's where it looked like it was going, yeah.
The other that struck me too is there was a few years ago the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it was all the big cities had it, where there was the 1%ers at the top own and operate everything, and the 99%ers have to turn it over, which again has a sort of a bubbling up from below complaint of the system. And as you said, Brian McLaren starts out looking like that's where he's going to go,
right.
But he takes us by surprise by broadening the relationships among all those levels to where they actually are caring about one another. Anything, first thing that struck you in particular in this chapter?
When are the multitudes not multitudes? And what I mean by that, let those who have eyes to see. When I looked at that, I think of multitudes, I think of wow. You know,
crowds.
Multitudes, crowds, and yet those crowds are invisible. For example, I have a son who's schizophrenic. He's 50 years old, lived in Alpena almost all his life. People don't see him, and they don't see the mentally ill community in Alpena, which is quite large and very significant. People that don't have somebody in that community don't understand that there is a whole viable community of mentally ill people. Also, I remember when we were at this church starting Habitat for Humanity and looking to find housing for the homeless. I can't tell you how many leaders in town and all around the community said, we don't have any homeless in Alpena. Well,
invisible.
Yes, we did, and we do. And but they're invisible. And so when I looked at the multitudes, I kept thinking, in my own experience, for example, when I was a pastor here 20 years almost, if I could say that. And when I retired, I could not come back for a year, at least. I mean, that's the ethics of the thing. And I thought, oh, that's all right, I'll see my friends around town. And you realize, I saw almost nobody. I mean, I went to the same grocery stores and stuff, but they kind of, I wasn't where they were anymore.
So were you the invisible one, or were they invisible?
I think they were the invisible ones, and probably I was too. What I'm saying is, when you think of multitudes, you think of large crowds. You think of U of M Stadium with 100 and some thousand people in it, or Waldo Stadium at Western. We gotta give Western a plug. And you think of crowds which are very visible. But when you talk about that woman by the well, she was invisible. When you talk about the Pope, when he was here riding in his little Fiat, I love that, riding in a little Fiat, saw the child on the big parade and went out and the severely disabled man who went out and kissed them. You know, even now, people were shocked. Look, he saw that person, that disabled person by the road. Look, he saw that child that needed to be. So it's still shocking today when the church stops and opens its eyes and sees, because in the midst of the multitude, our eyes are often blind. So that's the first thing that struck me.
It was very helpful to me, because I had the same sense that this is about the multitudes, the hoi polloi, the many. And yes, there are many like that are vulnerable, that are weak, that are broken, that are in need. There are many, but it's not really a crowd of them. It's not really a mass of them. It's one individual after another, and now they're all along the road that are invisible, and there's many of them. That's very good.
And we also live in our own circle, and we don't, even in a small town like Alpena, we kind of have people, well, same thing happens after church, and you go up for the donuts and coffee, the same people sit with the same people. I mean, we tend to flock and gather together with people who are like us, and there's a huge gay community in this, in Alpena, and I bet you most people don't realize that there really is a large community of, and so the multitudes are made up of smaller groups, and those smaller groups are made up of even smaller groups, and those smaller groups are made up of individuals, and Jesus somehow was able to see the individual as well as the
all
group.
levels. And that also moves us way away from the social analysis of the top-down pyramid that we were originally thinking that this was going to be about.
And especially to disprove the idea that he was trying to inflame or organize or unite the lower classes to rise up, and he would stand with them. That's the phrase used here at the end. He stood. That sounds aggressive, and you know, that's what I wanted to. And especially when you consider that the crowd became exactly what Jesus didn't want at the end. You know, that rather than individuals, they became a mass, and they missed his message, and they wanted to crucify him, and they became
a mob, a
mob,
multitude
right,
that way.
right.
I already, just since you alluded to it, the final concluding sentences in Brian McLaren's chapter says, there are always multitudes at the bottom being marginalized, scapegoated, shunned, ignored, and forgotten by the elite at the top. And there are always those in the middle, torn between the two. To be alive in the adventure of Jesus is to stand with the multitudes, even if doing so means marginalized, being criticized, and being misunderstood right along with them. I took that seriously when I preached about it today, but said it's not just that we stand with the marginalized or with the multitude. We stand with anybody who's marginalized, even the wealthy guy who's being marginalized by the crowd. And they wouldn't let Zacchaeus come to see Jesus because he was just a little runt of a guy here. He's chief tax collector, he's elite, he's wealthy, but they're dismissing him because he's marginalized by the crowd. So sometimes the multitude turns against the individual. And your picture of the crucified the mob is exactly that. Turned against Jesus. When on Palm Sunday, they turned with Jesus, but in both cases as Messiah or as scapegoater. However, they weren't seeing him as a person the way he was.
Just to jump on the scapegoat, one of the ways to express what I was afraid of and you know, put off by the way it started was, it sounded to me like we were going to be scapegoating the elites, blaming them in a kind of let's turn the thing up, turn it on its head, and I'll stand with you, and we're going to overturn. No, he didn't ask Zacchaeus to stop being a tax collector. It was a very personal thing. He didn't want to change the tax system and the Roman soldiers and all of that. But it was
But there was something that he did change in Zacchaeus, and my favorite story in the Old Testament is the story of Jonah. And the reason it is that Jonah doesn't go to Nineveh because he hates the Ninevites. They're not human, they're subhuman. And so he runs away to Tarshish. And when he gets back, he says, why didn't you go to Nineveh? And he says, well, because I knew you were a loving God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. That's not the kind of God he wanted. He wanted the God that would punish the Ninevites. He wanted the God that would punish the aliens who were coming over the border from Mexico into the United States. He wanted a God who would build a wall, who would keep him safe. And so he was confronted with this, no, you have to love the Ninevites, those people who are alien to you. And Zacchaeus, what happened to Zacchaeus, I think is so important, is that his salvation came in action. He said, today salvation has come upon this house. Why? Because Zacchaeus, all of a sudden his eyes were open and he saw the multitudes. He didn't take care of the multitudes. All of a sudden he saw them. It wasn't that Jesus said, okay, go out and give half away. But when your eyes are open and all of a sudden you see them out there, and then salvation came, and it isn't that all of a sudden Zacchaeus gave some sort of creed or some sort of sentence. His heart and his sight were changed. And he said, oh, look, I see these people. I'm going to give half of my goods to them.
And I think in addition to seeing them, he realizes how wealthy and how resourceful he was, and he could make a difference in their lives.
Right.
And so that both of those, to not see them in the first place, so everybody's getting richer, you're comparing yourself with the next richer guy here, keep up with the Joneses, my mansion's bigger than your mansion, and my car is better than your car. I mean, we could do that. Or you can say, look at all this asset value that I have, and look at what a difference I could make if I encouraged, enabled, empowered, resourced that mass. So he both saw them and recognized his own resources.
And he also just felt how good it was when Jesus recognized him as a marginalized, weak, disregarded person, and he saw Jesus. So in other words, that experience of how good that felt that Jesus recognized him probably led to seeing all the little Zacchaeuses around him and wanting to do the same kind of thing.
Yeah, the word radical comes from the word radix in Latin, which means to be rooted.
The roots.
And I think that's what truly being radical is being rooted in reality and to be grounded. And so there was a radical change in Zacchaeus' heart. And also Jesus was able to see in the Samaritan woman, not a Samaritan, but a woman. When he see a child, he saw not a group of children, but he saw a child. And I think, I remember, I watched the movie, there was a series a long time ago about Germany and the Auschwitz and the labor camps, and they were taking a whole group of Jews to be killed in the gas chambers. And what I remember about it, and what almost everybody I talked to who saw it later remembered about it, in that movement over there, there was one girl who turns and looks over her mother's shoulder into the camera. The multitudes didn't move you, but that one face, knowing where she was going in the movie, looking at you, changed the whole mood, whereas if everybody was just the multitudes moving in, it wouldn't have the same movement as saying, those are human beings.
I think Steven Spielberg did a really fine thing in his Schindler's List, and precisely that deal. He did the whole thing in black and white, which is an odd thing in today's movie industry to do. Except for one place, there was one spot of pink in the entire thing, and that was the little girl who had the pink on her, there was a rose or whatever, and you saw her in the crowd, and she stood out because that was the only color in the entire show. And then the same thing, later you saw that pink robe off to the side, you realized she was one of them that had gone off into the death camp. So it did just that, it turned it into a human being instead of just a multitude, instead of just a group that are going through an experience, it was a person going through it.
It's so easy to dehumanize a multitude.
Well, we've been talking about some of the things that just challenged us, and some of us, our expectation of where it was going to go, and seeing as we were reading the chapter or listening to the sermon, it didn't go there completely. It was there, but it got broadened. But was there anything in particular that encouraged you, that when you read this and you were done, you said, oh, aha, I'm glad I heard that. It was inspiring. Was there anything inspiring and encouraging in the material that we read?
Well, when you say in the material read, I just want to say, I think maybe I already said it, I love the way you ended the presentation, where you really was making the point I was going to come and try to make, is that Jesus, you know, our slogan about whoever you are, he wasn't siding with this group against that group. He was, and as I listened to all of those meeting stories, is his tenderness and his forgiveness and his companionship was always addressed to the problem person. You know, and I'd like to ask both of you a question. In the idea that I didn't come to save the righteous but the sick. Who is that? Isn't he saying, look, I didn't come to heal all these, the lower echelon. The sick in that phrase are the elite, the people that hosted him at these banquets and so on, and the Pharisees. His love and compassion and forgiveness was addressed to the Pharisees and the people who.
I agree with you entirely. And one of the things that struck me is Jesus' dinner invitation. He invites Levi to be a follower, a tax collector, a put down, marginalized, negative person in the people's experience, and yet he has him as part of his team. And then he goes to the Pharisees' house, and the Pharisees were such dividers, and they were the ones with the Sabbath law crowd, and they were the ones, the purity cult, they were the ones that were always dividing people from people, us against them. I would not have gone there, because I just don't want to go there.
I love that, and what you
but
said.
Jesus did. He was much more gracious, much more creative, much more forgiving than I am. And therefore, I'm sure it changed the hearts of a lot of those people at that dinner party when he held up the prostitute who's been forgiven as the example of love and generosity and an extravagant welcome with her tears and her perfume and everything, as opposed to the miserly judgmentalism of his hosts.
But you can also turn this around and say, the rich are marginalized.
Yeah.
I mean, I talk to people and they've got everything they need, you know, or I don't drive through that area of Alpena because, you know, those homes are all $250,000. They've got everything they need. Do they?
And Jesus loved them.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is, they may have as many problems as the rest of us, but we look at them and categorize them as the rich, the powerful, or whatever, so you kind of isolate them. One of the things that struck me this morning was the opening hymn, God of grace, God of glory. One thing was wrong, it says, grant us wisdom and courage for the facing of this hour. We didn't need wisdom and courage to face that hour at church. But
well, we did when he wrote that.
Yeah. But what I wanted to say is, to me, that is so important. Grant us wisdom, which is the ability to have our eyes open and our ears open, because all of us are blind and all of us are deaf in some way. And then on the other hand, to grant us the courage that once we see, to be able to act like Jesus. As you know, the earliest title for Christians was not Christian, but it was the people of the way, the people who follow Jesus. And that's what I think is so important, that I would like Zacchaeus 2.0. You know, who did he follow after he left? You know, he was changed, and what changed in the way he saw the world, and how did that help him mature throughout the rest of his life?
I want to throw in two things real quickly. One of them is about Zacchaeus. Having twice led tours of the Holy Land, I like going to Jericho. It's one of those locations I really enjoy. And there's a sycamore tree there that's a couple thousand years old. And it's a big old tree, and it's got a border around it. Says, this is the tree Zacchaeus climbed up. Now, the tourism board probably makes those distinguishing things. But I think it's the fact they're claiming him as one of their tourist points, and one of the places where this is the tree, that's where he was, this is where Jesus was. I mean, it's a nice thing to realize that story is still being held in high regard. So part of your Zacchaeus 2.0 is 2,000 years later, that story still means a lot and is told everywhere. That name means something. The second thing was, I was struck that he wasn't the only elite or power broker or upper crust person. When you think of the burial of Jesus, you have Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, who was able to go to Pilate and talk to the governor and say, I want that body that's hanging on the tree there that you just executed, and I want to bury it in my own tomb. So that's a mover and a shaker. That's somebody who can walk into Pilate and get the body that's just been crucified.
And Nicodemus.
And then Nicodemus, the second one, was with him. Nicodemus was a member of the Sanhedrin. He'd had personal conversations in the Gospel of John with Jesus. That's where we get that John 3:16 passage. And then there's talks where, okay, you're saying the same thing I am, but I'm just saying it quicker.
I made a list of Pharisees and people in power who, come across the Roman soldier, Paul of Tarsus. He wasn't programmatically against people of power and influence.
And he had direct conversations with them, as he would with anybody who he cares about. The Spirit blows like the wind, and you know in his passing, he's taking seriously. Nicodemus listens. He's taking seriously. The woman at the well is listening.
One of the things you said, I think, is very important in the sermon. So often we beat up on the Pharisees. They're a multitude. They're the evil ones. They're the ones against Jesus.
Right.
And as you said in your sermon, these were the righteous people of the day. They were literally, as best as they could, in that time and place, trying to be close to God. Now, it so happens that is a very restrictive understanding, which builds walls and barriers and things. But these were not
mean-spirited, angry people.
Well, I'm sure there were some, but not all of them. And that somehow we have to understand that they're coming at Jesus and questioning Jesus. They were coming, if we can grant them the idea that they were being honest, that they were trying to reflect Moses and Yahweh, Elohim, whoever, the God of they were trying. Now, when you get further up to Herod, it gets a little more mixed, I think. But even Herod didn't have it. I mean, Herod had in some ways everything he wanted, but he was also a person in need.
I think that was the thing at the very beginning. We were saying that Jesus actually saw the need for reconciliation, the need for inclusion, the need for open-mindedness, of embrace of something. There's a need in every person. And he was able to address it, whether it's a woman with a flow of blood or whether it's a wealthy person who has no sense of who their neighbors are. If it's the lawyer who says, but who is my neighbor? And he tells the Good Samaritan story. He's able to attach each person to where their need was.
And he also he anticipates and comes against people thinking that the proper response to this kind of corruption and abuse is to pick up a sword and resist. I mean, that's all over the place. The scene in the garden, he did not recommend that.
We're getting ready to wrap up. I just want to say that there's a question all the way that came through this to me, and I'll make it as quick as I can. When is enough enough? The bottom don't have enough money and enough resources. The people at the top many times have more resources than they need. And I know in my own life, one of the questions I ask, when do I have enough? When is enough enough?
And when you decide that you have enough, then you can be generous with whatever else there is, because your enough is covered.
Yeah.
But if there's never enough, never enough, then we're done.
But you have to ask that question.
Yeah. Well, that's Jesus and the multitudes. And we're grateful for all of you who are here with us or watching this.